When my husband passed away, his family treated me like I was worthless. They didn't wait, they didn't grieve with me, they didn't comfort me. They threw me out of the house we had built together like I was nothing. I remember standing there with just a suitcase in my hand, the door slamming behind me, realizing in that moment I was not only a widow, I was unwanted. And then, just when I thought my life couldn't fall any lower, the phone rang. A lawyer's voice on the other end said words I never expected. Your husband left millions, properties, businesses, and all of it is yours. I was stunned into silence, barely able to process it. The first words that tumbled out of my mouth were, "What about the house, the one his family is living in?" The lawyer didn't hesitate. That house is yours now. You are the legal owner. And in that instant, with my heart pounding, I said firmly, "Send them a notice." And before I dive deeper into how this all unfolded, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from right now? Which city are you in? Because maybe, just maybe, you and I are closer than you think. Maybe you've passed by someone living a story like mine without ever realizing the storm they were caught in. Now, here's where things start to get messy. That notice wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the spark that lit an entire firestorm. Because when my in-laws received it, they went ballistic. Imagine their faces when they opened that envelope, expecting to live out the rest of their lives in my husband's house, and instead finding out that I was the one who legally owned it now. They thought they had won, that by throwing me out, they had erased me from his life. But suddenly, I was back. Not as the helpless widow they had cast aside, but as the rightful owner of everything they had tried to steal. But before I tell you how they reacted, let me rewind for a moment, because to really understand the depth of this revenge, you need to know the history. From the day I married into that family, I was treated like an outsider. His mother, she never accepted me. She would smile when my husband was in the room, but the second his back was turned, her eyes went cold. His brother, he didn't even hide it. He would make little comments, snide remarks about where I came from, how I wasn't their kind of people. They tolerated me because my husband loved me, nothing more. But he did love me, deeply, fiercely. He used to tell me, "Don't worry about them, they'll come around. What matters is us." And for a long time, that was enough. Until he got sick. That's when their claws really came out. Suddenly, every decision I made for his care was questioned. If I brought him soup, they'd say it wasn't what he liked. If I tucked him in, they'd say I wasn't gentle enough. They started planting doubts, whispering in his ear, making me feel like I was failing him. But every night, when it was just us, he would take my hand and tell me he trusted me, that he knew I was doing everything I could. And then, when he passed, it was like they had been waiting for that moment. They didn't give me a week, not even a day to breathe. They stood in that house, arms crossed, faces hard, and told me to leave. I begged them. I begged them. I told them I had nowhere else to go, that I needed time, that I was still trying to hold myself together, but they didn't care. They pushed me out the door like I was some intruder. I walked away from the only home I had left, clutching the suitcase that felt heavier than my own body. So when that lawyer called, when he told me about the will, it wasn't just about money. It wasn't just about property. It was about justice. It was about finally having something that proved my husband had loved me enough to make sure I was taken care of, even after death. And more than that, it was about finally having the power to stand up to the people who had crushed me when I was at my weakest. But let me tell you something. The moment you decide to fight back, that's when you see who people really are. And my in-laws, they were about to show me just how far their greed and hatred could go. When the notice landed in their hands, I could practically feel the shock ripple through the walls of that house. The lawyer told me he had delivered it personally, that he had watched their faces as they read it. His mother's lips pressed tight, trembling with fury. His brother's jaw clenched, the color draining from his face as the reality sank in. They weren't the owners. They never had been. The house, the very place they had so smugly kicked me out of, belonged to me now. Legally, officially, undeniably. And all it took was a single piece of paper to bring their empire of arrogance crashing down. At first, there was silence. No response, no phone calls, no attempts to reach out. I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd accept the truth, pack their things and leave quietly. But you and I both know people like them don't go down without a fight. A week later, I got the first call. It was his brother, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you can take this house from us? You think a piece of paper means anything? You're nothing. You've always been nothing." I let him rant, let him spit his poison through the phone, but when he stopped to take a breath, I said calmly, "You have 30 days to vacate. After that, you'll be trespassing." And then I hung up. My hands were shaking, but my voice had been steady. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't powerless anymore. The next few weeks were hell. They refused to leave. Instead, they started spreading rumors, worse than before. Suddenly, I was the quote-unquote gold digger widow who had manipulated my husband into signing everything over to me. They told neighbors, friends, even distant relatives, twisting the story so much that some people actually started to believe them. Every time I stepped out of my small apartment, I felt eyes on me, whispers following me down the street. But I held on to one thought, one truth. They were living in my house, and every day that passed brought me closer to the moment I could legally force them out. Still, it wasn't easy. There were nights I lay awake wondering if I should just give up, maybe sell the house, walk away from all of it, start fresh somewhere far away. But then I'd remember the way his mother looked at me that night she told me to leave, the way his brother smirked as I dragged my suitcase to the door, the way they erased me from my husband's life as if I had meant nothing. And I'd whisper to myself, no, not this time. They don't get to win. The day of the eviction hearing finally came. I walked into that courtroom with my head held high, though inside my heart was pounding so hard I thought everyone could hear it. They were already there, sitting together like vultures, glaring at me as if I had committed some crime against them. Their lawyer tried everything, claimed my husband had been too sick to make decisions when he signed the will, claimed I had pressured him, claimed the documents were forged. But my lawyer had every record, every signature, every medical note proving my husband had been of sound mind. When the judge finally spoke, the words felt like thunder. "The property belongs to the widow. You are hereby ordered to vacate immediately." I can't even describe the look on their faces. His mother's lips parted, but no words came out. His brother's fist slammed the table, echoing through the room. And me? I just sat there, silent, tears welling in my eyes, not because I was sad, but because for the first time in months, I felt vindicated. I had been crushed, broken, cast aside, but I had risen back up. Of course, that wasn't the end. People like them don't vanish quietly. When the eviction notice was enforced, they left the house in shambles. Broken furniture, trash everywhere, walls scratched up as if they wanted to scar the home itself before letting it go. It hurt, yes, but standing in the doorway of that house, my house, I felt something stronger than pain. I felt power. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about a house anymore. This was about revenge. Not the petty kind, not the kind that fades after a few insults. This was deeper. They had humiliated me when I was at my lowest, and now I had the means to make them taste their own medicine. So I made a decision. I wouldn't just take back what was mine. I'd make sure they understood the weight of every cruel word, every shove, every lie. Step by step, I was going to dismantle the life they thought they had stolen from me. Be honest, would you have done the same? Would you have stopped at just reclaiming the house, or would you have pushed further, knowing the power was finally in your hands? Because trust me, this was only the beginning. They thought losing the house would be the end of it. They thought they'd taught me my place and the lesson would stick.
That's the arrogance of people who've never been made to account for their cruelty. They assume the story ends when it suits them. But standing in my hallway among the dust and the dents they left like battle scars, I felt something else. A cold, clear resolve. This wasn't about being petty. This was about making sure their lies and their violence against me had consequences. Not because I wanted to destroy them for the sake of it, but because I refused to be erased without a fight. First thing I did was what anyone who's been burned learns to do. I gathered information. Names, dates, small things that seemed meaningless at the time, but would matter later. Where they banked, who they did business with, which neighbors had seen them move things out in the dark of the night, the contractor who'd done their renovations. I went through boxes in the attic that they'd left behind, found receipts, photos, a stack of notes my husband had kept that mentioned payments and meetings. I made a list. It felt odd at first, almost clinical, taking apart the life they'd built with the same hands that had pulled me apart. But you get used to being methodical when your heart beats on the line. I hired a lawyer with a spine, someone who didn't flinch when family wars got messy. He told me plainly, if we're going to hold them accountable, we have to be surgical. Public, bitter fights make people look like victims. Quiet, deliberate pressure is what breaks them. That was my new mantra. Surgical, deliberate, hidden pressure. I didn't want to see their faces in court on a reality show. I wanted to dismantle the foundations they stood on brick by brick until they had nothing left to stand on. So, we began. We audited the businesses my husband used to run with his brother. What at first looked tidy on paper had the usual rotting surprises beneath. Unpaid taxes, an old shell company nobody remembered setting up, contracts signed with ambiguous clauses. My lawyer and a forensic accountant started filing claims and notices where they fit. Creditors were notified of potential mismanagement. I knew that hitting where it hurts for them wouldn't be dramatic headlines, so much as tightening screws. Supplier calls, bank hold notices, notices of intent. They began to lose access to credit lines they'd relied on. One by one, doors that had always been open to them started to lock.
But this isn't the clean part of the story. You know how people escalate when they feel cornered? My in-laws went nuts. The brother tried to stab at me legally, filing a series of petty claims asserting coercion and fraud. His lawyer sent letters dripping with threats. Their mother, in a fury, showed up at the small apartment I'd rented one evening, shouting beneath my window until neighbors called the police. I sat inside and listened to her scream the most intimate lies about me, the same ones she'd told before. And when she finally left, I was trembling, not from fear, but from the strain of holding myself together. There were nights when the campaign nearly unraveled. A creditor called my lawyer demanding proof. The accountant's findings were delayed because a crucial file in archives had been misfiled for months. Someone anonymously posted an edited video online suggesting I'd conspired to manipulate my husband in his final days. Views and comments piled up like a second assault. For a terrifying week, it felt like every step forward came with 2 steps back. In those moments, I asked myself the question I ask you now. Would you have kept going when the whole world seemed to conspire to stop you? I did. Maybe because I had nothing left to lose, or maybe because his face kept appearing in my mind. The way he'd laughed at stupid jokes, the way he'd squeezed my hand and said, "We're in this together." So I doubled down. I started quietly building allies. The neighbor who'd seen the brother leave the house at odd hours with a duffel bag, the contractor who admitted on a recording that payments had gone missing, the maid who remembered phone calls that suggested someone was moving funds. Little threads, not flashy, but they added up. There was a close call that still makes my stomach drop when I think about it. We subpoenaed a ledger from a third-party supplier, a document that would have been fatal to their repairs on paper narrative. They knew that if the ledger surfaced in court, bankruptcy filings and criminal investigations could follow. The brother panicked. He attempted to transfer assets to a distant cousin that afternoon, a move so clumsy and hurried it looked like someone trying to run with too many plates. My team intercepted the transfer, froze the accounts with legal paperwork, and for a week my nights were filled with the sound of my own breath. In, out, in, out. Close calls teach you patience and a new kind of courage. There was also a quieter kind of revenge I allowed myself. I restored the house. After the mess they left, nails in the walls, gouges on the banister, cigarette burns on the porch, I brought people in to clean and fix, not because I felt vindictive about paint and polish, but because reclaiming a space where his memories lived felt like a prayer. I would stand in the kitchen at dawn with a cup of tea, listening to the house breathe and imagine him smiling at the ridiculousness of it all. Small acts of restoration became my armor. As the pressure mounted, their relationships started to fray in public and in private. Long-hidden resentments between them surfaced. Creditors walked away, a key supplier reneged on a contract. Their social circle, the people who'd once nodded with approval and accepted their version of events, began to doubt. Invitations stopped coming. The mother, who'd been the family's public face, found herself increasingly isolated, while the brother heated up with anger that had nowhere productive to go. Through it all, I kept asking the audience, keep asking yourself, what would you have done in my shoes? Would you have sought quiet justice or shouted it from the rooftops? Would you have craved ruin or looked for repair? Because sometimes revenge isn't only about making the other person pay. Sometimes it's about teaching yourself that you can survive, rebuild, and choose the kind of person you want to be when the dust settles.
Just when I thought the pressure I'd put on them was finally starting to crack their armor, the ground shifted beneath my feet. We unearthed something in the papers, a tangled, ugly thread none of us had expected. Buried in an old set of accounts was a name I recognized from the earliest days of my husband's business, a name tied to a shell company that funneled money through a chain of accounts overseas. At first, it looked like the usual off-book maneuvering wealthy people use to dodge taxes or hide losses. But the more my lawyer and the forensic accountant dug, the clearer it became. This went beyond clever bookkeeping. There were transfers that suggested fraud, insurance claims with suspicious timings, and payments that matched dates when the brother had said he was repairing things in the business. In short, there was a possibility, a real, terrifying possibility, that someone in that family had been cooking the books for years. That revelation changed everything. What had been a battle over a house and pride suddenly had the potential to become criminal. If the accountant's evidence held up, it could trigger investigations, not just civil suits. I'd gone from being the wronged widow to a witness and possibly the catalyst in exposing a deeper web of corruption. My lawyer laid it out plainly. If we move forward, this will ruin them. It could also put you under a microscope. He wasn't trying to scare me, he was making sure I knew the stakes. The strategy shifted from surgical pressure to one that had to balance legal prudence with force. We could expose them completely, but we also had to be ready for retaliation that would be louder and uglier than before. And retaliation came. The brother, desperate, began to lash out in ways I hadn't predicted. He hired aggressive private investigators who started digging into my past. For a week, I felt watched. Cars parked near my apartment, someone at times following me to the grocery store, shadows at the parking garage. My phone started getting weird calls, the kind with heavy breathing and silence. Nothing said, but everything implied. I reported some of it to the police, who were polite but overworked. They left me with promises and a thin folder of incident reports. It was unnerving, but I refused to let fear be my constant companion. If anything, the pressure hardened me. Then came the smear campaign's next phase. The brother's lawyer began leaking selective documents to the press. Small things at first. Out-of-context emails, a doctored photo of my husband at a fundraiser next to a man with a questionable reputation. It was designed to muddy the water, to make me look messy, unstable, possibly complicit. I watched my name in captions and comments, felt strangers weigh my life and decide I deserved whatever came next. Friends who had once comforted me began to hesitate, their messages polite but distant. The isolation returned in a new form. But remember, I wasn't the same woman who had walked out with a suitcase months ago. I had learned to move quietly, to keep my cards close, to turn small losses into advantages. For every piece the brother and his team leaked, I had a counter. Recorded testimonies, bank records, timestamps on emails proving intent and knowledge. We matched transfers to calls. We matched meetings to invoices. Piece by piece, the narrative they had tried to spin for years, that my husband was incompetent, that they were his saviors, started to unravel. There was a particular evening that still sits in my chest like a stone. My lawyer called and said, "We've got enough to press for a preliminary criminal inquiry." My heart thudded so hard I could barely hear. This was the moment we'd been building toward, the moment that could either exonerate my husband's name and finally crush their lies, or drag me through a legal quagmire that would take years to settle. I asked him plainly, "Are you sure?" He said, "I'm as sure as I can be. We have ledgers, witness statements, and a paper trail that points to deliberate concealment." We filed. The papers went to the state agency that handles financial crimes. The reaction was immediate. Investigators opened files, subpoenas flew, accounts were frozen. The brother's face, once smug and untouchable, became tight with worry. His mother called me, not with fury this time, but with a strangled plea I'll never forget. "Please, think of our family. Don't destroy us." For a moment, I heard in her voice the woman who had once comforted my husband when he was ill, or maybe I imagined that. It didn't matter. What mattered was that she had not sounded like that when she threw me out. The plea felt like a confession and a complaint rolled into one. As the investigation ramped up, the family's internal fractures became more visible. Allies turned away. One accountant who'd been friendly with the brother for years suddenly grew wary and asked to be removed from the files. Vendors who'd once offered lenient terms started demanding immediate payment. Even the mother's old friends sent aloof emails asking to distance themselves. Their social safety net was shredding in plain sight. But there were costs. The litigation and inquiry drew attention not just to their potential crimes, but to my late husband's affairs as well. Curious journalists dug into charities he'd supported, contracts he'd signed, small discrepancies that, on their own, meant nothing, but could be sensationalized in the wrong headline. I took a long, lonely walk that night, thinking about how this fight had spread like ripples beyond us, touching people we never intended to touch. Revenge had ethical dimensions I hadn't anticipated. Power left footprints. Would you have considered that before you struck? Could you have predicted the collateral damage? One of the most painful consequences came in the form of a friend who'd been close to my husband for years. He called, voice heavy, and said he didn't know which side to take anymore. "I can't be part of this," he said, and then put the phone down. I sat on the floor and let the silence carry me. Part of me understood. Loyalty is complicated, and fear makes people take the safer path. But the abandonment stung. It was a reminder that when you pull at threads, sometimes whole cloth unravels and the people you love fall through the holes. Despite the pain, the investigation did what we hoped. It brought truths to light. The agency served warrants, files were seized, the brother was questioned under oath. The mother, who had always been careful to stay a step removed from day-to-day dealings, found herself cornered with notes and receipts that bore her initials. I watched it unfold, at times numb, at times elated, and often with a profound sense of sorrow for how far the family had fallen. And then came the night that shifted everything again. Not with legal papers, but with a confession that arrived in the most unexpected way. A voicemail left on my phone at 2 a.m. The voice was quavering, small, shaky. It was the maid. She had worked in their house for years and had seen things. She whispered into the phone that she couldn't sleep, that the guilt had been eating at her. She said she'd kept copies of receipts and small notes hidden under the mattress for months because she didn't trust anyone. She said she could bring them. She'd tell the truth. When I heard that voicemail, I cried for an entire hour, not just because it was a vindication, but because I realized how many quiet people had carried the weight of this family's secrets, how many tiny truths had been locked away in drawers and dust. Her decision to come forward felt like a turning of the tide. What would you do if you found a quiet ally in the middle of a storm? Would you trust them? Would you let them stand up for you? Or push them away to protect them from the fallout? I had to decide fast, and I chose to accept her help. It was risky. Any witness could be intimidated or bought, but each piece of evidence brought us closer to holding the family to account.
The maid's confession didn't just add fuel to the fire. It threw open the floodgates. She arrived at my lawyer's office trembling, clutching a warm shopping bag stuffed with envelopes and folded papers. Her hands shook as she laid them out on the table. Receipts, handwritten notes, scraps of ledgers that hadn't been destroyed, even a few photographs she'd snapped discreetly with her old phone. On the surface, they looked like clutter, but when we pieced them together, a pattern emerged. Hidden payments, cash transactions that lined up with the shell accounts we'd already found, and, most damning of all, a note in the brothers' handwriting about keeping the widow away until this is done. I can't describe the feeling that coursed through me reading that line. Rage, grief, vindication, all tangled up. It wasn't just about money anymore. They had actively conspired to push me out, to make me disappear so they could protect their scheme. Every lie they had told, every humiliation they'd forced on me, wasn't just cruelty, it was calculated. With the maid's evidence, the investigators had what they needed to move fast. Subpoenas were served to banks, business partners, even their family doctor. The brother's face turned gray when he was called in for questioning. And the mother? She collapsed in public outside the courthouse, clutching her chest, playing the role of the fragile matriarch too delicate to endure such stress. The cameras ate it up. Suddenly, headlines weren't just about financial misconduct. They were about whether I was tormenting a grieving old woman. It was manipulative, and it worked on some people. Strangers online called me heartless, even evil. And that's when the betrayal came. A woman I'd considered a friend, someone who had been there for me in the early days of my grief, suddenly went quiet. Then one morning, I opened my phone to see a statement she had given to a gossip site. She said she couldn't stay silent anymore, that she thought I was exploiting the situation, that she doubted my intentions. She even implied I had known about my husband's wealth all along and was playing the victim for sympathy. I felt like the ground had been ripped from under my feet. This wasn't just some acquaintance. This was someone I had cried with, someone who had seen me at my lowest. And now she had chosen their side? Maybe for money, maybe for attention, maybe because she couldn't handle the pressure of being associated with me anymore. Whatever the reason, it cut deep. I confronted her. I asked her why. Her response was cold. "You don't know how powerful they are. You're playing with fire. I can't get burned with you." And that was it. She walked away from years of friendship like it was nothing. But here's the thing about betrayal. It can destroy you, or it can sharpen you. That night, I sat in the restored kitchen of the house they had once thrown me out of, staring at the freshly painted walls, and I made a decision. I wasn't just going to survive this. I was going to win. The investigation heated up. The brothers' legal team went on the offensive, filing motion after motion to delay proceedings, trying to bury us in paperwork. They leaked photos of the mother in a hospital bed, pale and weak, claiming my actions were killing her. They tried to weaponize public sympathy, painting me as a vindictive widow obsessed with revenge. But behind the theatrics, the evidence was undeniable. Every subpoena brought another crack in their story. The maid testified, her voice shaking but steady. Contractors admitted under oath that payments had been delayed or diverted. Bank officials confirmed suspicious transfers. It was like watching a dam split open one fracture at a time. Still, there was one night when doubt almost swallowed me whole. My lawyer and I were reviewing the case when he looked me dead in the eye and said, "You need to prepare for the possibility that this could all go public. Every detail of your marriage, your finances, your private life, it will be dragged out and dissected. Do you want that?" That question nearly broke me. Did I want the world to paw through my memories of my husband? Did I want strangers debating whether our love had been real? Whether I'd been a good wife? Whether I deserved what I had inherited? Or did I want to stop now, quietly, sell the house, move away, and let them limp on with their crumbling empire? I walked out into the night, the weight of that choice pressing down on me. The air was cold, the streets empty, and for the first time I spoke aloud to the silence, asking my husband what I should do. I swear, in that stillness I felt him. Not his voice, not a ghost, but the memory of his conviction, the way he'd squeeze my hand and say, "You're stronger than you think." So, I chose. I chose to keep going. Not because I craved headlines, not because I wanted to humiliate them in public, but because justice mattered more than fear. They had taken everything from me once, and I would not let them do it again. By the end of that week, the investigators had enough to recommend charges. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but the tide had turned. And as much as they tried to play the victim, as much as they begged for sympathy, the walls around them were closing in. They were desperate, and desperation makes people dangerous. Their last-ditch scheme wasn't quiet or subtle. It was brazen enough that for a moment I wondered if we'd underestimated how low they were willing to go. One night, a week after the investigators recommended charges, my lawyer called and said, "They're filing an emergency petition to have the will invalidated on grounds of undue influence. They've hired handwriting analysts and claim your husband was coerced. They're also alleging you threatened him in his final days." I sat very still and watched the kettle boil until it whistled, because my whole life felt like a kettle under pressure, and I was afraid the lid was about to blow. Their lawyers produced a stack of new witnesses. Distant cousins, a retired nurse who had appeared out of nowhere, a neighbor whose name I had never heard before. The filings were thick with legalese and accusations, written to look official and urgent. It was the kind of attack that works on appearances, a flood of paper that looks convincing until you look closely. But looking closely is what we'd learned to do. My lawyer flipped through pages and then said quietly, "There are inconsistencies, dates that don't line up, phone records that contradict their timeline." Still, paper can sway judges when the human heart is involved. They knew that painting me as the villain might be enough to stall everything for months, maybe years. So they doubled down. The brother began showing up at court in a new cloak of righteous grief, fingers stained with theatrics, eyes full of sorrow he didn't feel. The mother's health deteriorated in public like a performance. She was wheeled in, pale and trembling, and cameras swallowed the image whole. Sympathy is a currency people like them spend readily.
Then they tried to buy silence. A man with a heavy suit and an empty smile approached the maid outside the courthouse one afternoon. He offered her money and a promise. Testify that her earlier statements were mistakes, that she had misremembered dates, that she couldn't be trusted. He said, "You don't want trouble. Take the money and forget." The maid came to me after, hands shaking, and told me every word he'd said. She cried not from guilt anymore, but from fear. Fear that someone with pockets deeper than conscience could change everything. What would you have done if someone tried to buy the truth from the people who could untie the whole knot? Would you have asked them to take the money and run, to save themselves? Or would you have begged them to stand, to fight, to hold fast? I don't know if I was noble or
reckless, but I told her, we fight. We take it to the end. I promised protection, and I meant it. We alerted the investigators. The man's approach was documented. His cell pinged near the courthouse at the time he supposedly drove away. It became another thread in the net we were casting. But their most dangerous move came in the dead of night. Someone tried to set fire to the shed at the back of the house, a place where I kept some of my husband's things that I hadn't yet been able to catalog. I got the call from the housekeeper at 3 a.m. Smoke, a smell of rubber and oil, a neighbor shouting. I remembered the absurd clarity of thinking, this is it. Then I ran. The porch light cut through the dark, and I saw the scorch marks and a hastily abandoned gas can, the way a plan falls apart when someone forgets to remove their fingerprints. The police arrived quickly because the neighbor had a fire extinguisher and a phone and a nerve that wouldn't let them sleep. That night, I stood by the window as officers walked the yard with flashlights. The investigators told me later that the accelerant was crude and clumsy, not a professional arsonist's work, but desperate and dangerous all the same. They took photographs, dusted for prints, and kept the gas can as evidence. It was an attempt to intimidate, to erase things that could prove the truth. It failed, but it rattled me. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt truly afraid. Not of legal attacks or smear campaigns, but for my own safety. Yet fear didn't make me fold. It made me calculate differently. We tightened security, we moved the most fragile evidence into sealed storage under court order, and we asked the court for emergency protective measures for witnesses. The maid agreed to testify in a secure room. She sat with an investigator until dawn and told everything she knew. The retired contractor who had been paid under the table confirmed dates under oath. Small, quiet things piled up against the noisy, manufactured drama the brother tried to create. The courtroom became a battlefield of gestures and glances. They called character witnesses who painted me as cold and calculating. I called ones who spoke of small, human truths, the evenings my husband and I had shared, simple kindnesses I had offered during his illness, the man who'd seen us at the market buying fruit together. The judge listened. Judges are people, too. They are pulled by evidence and by the way stories are told. I learned to frame my grief so it didn't look performative, to let facts carry the weight of feeling. Then came the day for the hearing, where everything could have tipped. Their counsel presented a new handwriting expert with credentials that looked impressive on a CV. He stood and said with slow certainty that some signatures looked suspicious. My chest tightened as the courtroom buzzed. I could feel the momentum that a single expert opinion could create. My lawyer objected, cross-examined, and then produced an analysis of his own. Timestamps on emails, security footage of my husband signing documents months before. A bank clerk's affidavit. It became another duel of expertise, each side trading blows. The judge called a recess, and the world shrank to the scale of the hallways where lawyers paced and whispered. I walked out into the courthouse garden and let the sun hit my face. I asked the same question I ask you now. When everything is on the line, when people will try to make you small to save themselves, do you keep standing? I kept standing. The hearing reconvened, and the judge's ruling that day was cautious but firm. The emergency petition was denied, pending further analysis, and the will remained valid. It wasn't a final victory, but it was the kind of small triumph that keeps you breathing. As we left the courthouse, the brother slammed his palm against a granite column so hard the sound echoed. His face was a map of fury and fear. Their last-ditch scheme had failed for now, but failure breeds new plots. I realized then that the climax I'd dreamed of wasn't a single moment. It was a series of trials, each one more exhausting than the last. There were more battles ahead, the criminal charges that could bring them down, the public reckonings that would stain them for good, and a personal reckoning inside me about what kind of person I wanted to be once all was said and done. He crossed a line I had thought was off limits, not because of law, but because of decency. He started rewriting my husband's story in public, turning him into someone I didn't recognize. It began with small things, a speech at a community event where he described my husband as reckless with money, irresponsible, the kind of casual cruelty that rewrites a life in a single paragraph. But then it escalated. He gave interviews, spoke to reporters, painted my husband as a man who'd made bad choices and left a widow to pick up the pieces. He took our private jokes and our small traditions and presented them as evidence of instability, of an impulsive man who didn't know what he wanted. It was a theft of memory, and it cut me deeper than any false accusation about money ever could. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, a photo of him in my hands, reading the words in the paper until the letters blurred. I could feel my chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with the law and everything to do with betrayal. Who did he think he was to take the man I loved and turn him into a caricature? Was anything sacred to them? I called his brother and left a message that would have been calm if my voice hadn't cracked. I know you're old enough. You're not allowed to touch him. Not that way. He laughed when he called back, a sound like a slap. He's our son. We're just telling the truth. Truth. The word had been weaponized by them so often that I wanted to throw it out the window. That's when I stopped acting like a victim and started making choices with intention. Memory is fragile when it's out in the world. Once a lie is said aloud, people believe it. So I began collecting witnesses to who my husband had been. Friends from college I hadn't seen in years answered my calls. Old colleagues came forward, emails full of anecdotes about his laugh, his stubborn kindness, the way he always gave his umbrella to someone in need. I tracked down videos of him at charity events, clips of him coaching a Little League team, messages to family that showed thoughtfulness and care. I turned the narrative back toward truth, slowly, methodically, like turning pages back to the way they had originally been written. There was a particularly painful moment when his brother organized a small memorial at a club, a staged event full of people who'd been paid or cajoled into attendance. He spoke the kind of empty platitudes that are safe and comfortable, and afterward he made a toast to lessons learned and family resilience, as if the rest of us hadn't been ripped apart. I stood up then, unexpectedly, and recounted a memory, simple and true, about the first time my husband taught me to plant tomatoes on our balcony, how he celebrated small growth as if the whole world depended on it. The room fell quiet. Faces turned. People remembered. It was a tiny reclamation, but it mattered. Their campaign to tarnish his reputation grew reckless, and with that recklessness came contemptible acts. A tabloid ran a fabricated story suggesting my husband had been unfaithful in his last year, a story with no sources, no evidence, just a line designed to wound. Messages poured into my phone. Strangers accused me. Old friends hesitated. For a while, it felt like the world was a gale and I had no shelter. But each time they threw another stone, I turned and used it to build something. A written record, a collection of voices, witnesses who could testify not just in court, but to the people who needed to see the truth.
And there was something else I did. I started to live in his memory the way he had lived, not as an act of martyrdom, but as a way to keep what was real alive. I took over a small scholarship he'd quietly funded for underprivileged students. I organized a community cleanup in his name. These were not PR stunts. They were small, stubborn continuations of a life he would have approved of. They gave me a rhythm and purpose beyond the courtroom, a reason to wake up when the nights wanted to swallow me whole. Would you have done the same? Would you have used grief as fuel to make something better, or would you have let it eat you? There were moments when the strain broke me. A voicemail from his sister-in-law calling me a liar, an anonymous package left at my door with a mocking note, an overheard conversation where a banker joked about the widow who came out of nowhere. Those things stung, but they also showed me who I was dealing with. People who thought cruelty was an inheritance right.
I learned to let the small cruelties bounce off me like rain off a tarp. I learned to conserve my energy for the fights that mattered. Then, in a twist of irony, it was their frantic attempts to discredit the past that finally created the crack I needed. A former business partner, tired of being dragged into petty narratives, gave a long interview in which he recounted private moments with my husband. Moments of generosity and humor, of leadership without arrogance. He spoke of late-night calls where my husband encouraged employees through hard times, of a man who refused bonuses because he said the company was a team. The piece went viral among local circles. People began to ask uncomfortable questions about why the brother was trying so hard to rewrite these memories. Public sentiment started to shift. The mother's once stalwart supporters began to raise eyebrows when timelines didn't match or when the tabloid's sources evaporated under scrutiny. It felt like watching a slow tide roll in. You couldn't see it at first, but the shore changed under your feet. My in-laws' narrative began to crack, and when narratives crack, people start to look for new anchors. But the brother was not the kind of man to go down gracefully. He lashed out in private, a text to a mutual friend accusing me of fabricating stories for sympathy, a barbed message left on my voicemail, a thinly veiled threat on a community forum. He was dangerous because he was unmoored, and unmoored people take wild swings. I started to fear not just for my reputation, but for the safety of those who had stood with me. The maid who'd testified, the accountant who'd provided documents, the neighbor who'd kept watch. I took steps to protect them, to ensure they had legal counsel and safe places to stay if things escalated. And then, in a move that surprised everyone, the brother made his most fatal mistake. In an attempt to outflank me, he reached out to one of my husband's oldest friends, the very friend who had vouched for my husband's character years ago, and accused him of withholding information, of refusing to tell the whole story. He did it publicly, with theatrics, assuming the friend would fold under pressure. Instead, that friend stood up in a way that humbled me. He wrote a letter, signed it, and published it online. He recounted the truth about my husband, in detail, with dates and small memories that only a true friend could know. He described my husband's steadfastness, his carefulness with contracts, his insistence on integrity. The letter spread faster than any smear. It landed like a steadying hand on a gasping crowd. When I read it, I sat on the floor and let the weight of relief wash over me. For the first time in months, I allowed myself a small smile. It wasn't the end. There were still legal hurdles, still people to answer to, still nights when I'd wake with my heart racing. But something fundamental had shifted. Their attempt to steal his name had backfired. In exposing him to ridicule, they had given me the chance to show who he really was. The days leading up to the decisive hearing felt like the air before a storm. Heavy, tense, charged with the kind of silence that makes your skin prickle. Every move mattered. Every document mattered. Every whispered conversation in the courthouse hallway carried the weight of futures hanging in the balance. My lawyer told me, "We're close, but we need one more nail in the coffin. Something irrefutable, something they can't twist." I didn't know where that nail would come from. Most of what I had was already in the open. The maid's testimony, the contractors, the bank records. Strong, but still vulnerable to clever lawyering and theatrics. And then, in a moment so ordinary it didn't feel real, it arrived. It was a worn, padded envelope, postmarked from a small storage facility on the edge of town. The return name was familiar, an old colleague of my husband's, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Inside was a flash drive and a short note written in neat, deliberate handwriting. He asked me to hold this, said if anything happened to him, it should go to you. I'm sorry it took me this long. My hands shook as I plugged the drive in.
What loaded on the screen nearly stopped my heart. Folders of scanned contracts, emails, letters. But the most powerful file was a video, a simple recording, dated weeks before his death. My husband, sitting in his office, speaking directly to the camera. His face was tired, but his voice was steady. "If you're seeing this," he said, "I probably didn't get to explain everything to you myself. I've made arrangements, and I want it to be clear this was my decision. My wife has nothing to do with the way the assets are structured. I wanted her to be safe. I wanted her to have what I worked for. If my family disputes this, no, it's not because of me. It's because they can't let go of control. But this is mine to give, and it's hers." I watched it once, then twice, then I couldn't stop crying. The proof I'd been praying for wasn't just legal, it was personal. His voice cutting through the lies like a blade. This wasn't a forged document or an accountant's testimony. This was him. His face, his words, his intent. It was the kind of evidence no smear campaign could bury. The next day in court, my lawyer unveiled it at just the right moment. The brother's attorney was mid-sentence, spinning a tale about undue influence, about a frail man manipulated in his final days, when the judge allowed us to submit the recording. The lights dimmed, the video played, and the room fell silent. I will never forget their faces. The brother's jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might break. The mother gasped loudly, clutching at her chest, as though the very act of hearing her son's words had betrayed her performance. The judge leaned forward, eyes fixed on the screen. And me? I sat very still, tears sliding down my face, not out of weakness, but out of something stronger, vindication. The video ended, and for a moment the silence was so thick you could hear the buzz of the fluorescent lights. My lawyer let the silence stretch before saying quietly, "This is his voice. This is his will."
The hearing shifted in that instant. Their arguments faltered, their theatrics deflated. The smear campaigns still existed, the petitions were still technically active, but the tide had turned. Public opinion, once so easily swayed by their crocodile tears, began to harden against them. Strangers who had called me greedy now messaged me with apologies. Reporters who had printed their lies requested interviews, eager to correct themselves. But victory never comes without backlash. That same night, as I pulled into the driveway, I saw something spray-painted in thick red letters across the garage. Liar, thief, fraud. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. They weren't going to give up quietly. This wasn't just about money to them anymore. It was about humiliation, about control slipping through their fingers, about the narrative being ripped away. I stood there, staring at the dripping paint, and thought, this is their breaking point. They've lost the legal ground, and now they'll lash out like cornered animals. Would you have been scared in my place? Be honest. If your enemies had already tried fire, already tried smears, already tried buying off witnesses, and now they were leaving threats on your doorstep, would you have packed up and left? Or would you have stood your ground? I stood mine. I wasn't leaving my home again. Not this time. We cleaned the paint, I strengthened security even further, and I prepared for the final stage of the trial, the point where charges would either be filed against them or dismissed, where all the pieces we'd built would either hold together or shatter under pressure. The final showdown didn't begin with fireworks. It began with the shuffle of papers, the quiet scrape of chairs, and the judge's gavel calling the courtroom to order. But the air was electric, humming with tension. Everyone knew this was it. Weeks of whispers, months of battles, years of resentment, all funneled into this day. The benches were full. Reporters sat poised with notepads, their pens twitching like they could already taste the story. The prosecution laid everything out first. Clean, methodical, devastating. They didn't start with the millions or the properties.
They started with small things, like the missed payments to contractors, the suspicious transfers, the shell accounts. Each witness was called, sworn in, and questioned. The maid's voice quivered at first, but by the time she finished, her tone was steady, clear, unshakable. The accountant followed, armed with files and spreadsheets, pointing out anomalies with precision. Piece by piece, the story of fraud and deception unfolded like a tapestry. Not rushed, not sensational, but solid. Then came the video, the one that my husband had left behind. Played again, this time in front of a packed courtroom, it had a different kind of power. The silence was so deep, you could hear breaths catch in throats. The brothers stared at the table, refusing to look up. The mother dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, but the tremor in her hand was real now, not performance. When the video ended, the prosecution didn't speak immediately. They let his words echo in the silence, let the truth settle over every person in that room like a weight no one could ignore.
And then it was their turn. The defense came out swinging. They called me manipulative, suggested I'd orchestrated everything, implied I'd isolated my husband in his final days. They dragged up emails, mundane, ordinary emails, and twisted them into sinister suggestions. They even hinted that the video itself was doctored, a claim so desperate the courtroom murmured in disbelief. But they didn't stop there. They called character witnesses who painted me as cold, distant, unfeeling. A woman who'd once been my friend took the stand and claimed I'd spoken of money before love. Each word was a blade, sharp and deliberate. My lawyer rose for cross-examination, and here's where the cracks started to widen. Dates didn't match, statements contradicted earlier depositions. One witness admitted under pressure that she'd been encouraged to testify, her eyes darting toward the brother as she said it. The judge noticed. The jury noticed. You could feel the shift in the room, the balance tipping back. And then came the brother himself. He took the stand in his perfectly pressed suit, his face arranged in sorrow. He spoke of loyalty, of family bonds, of a widow who had turned on them. He tried to cry, actual tears, but they wouldn't come. Instead, he rambled, lost his footing, contradicted himself. When pressed about the fraudulent accounts, he fumbled, blamed a cousin, then backtracked. It was like watching a wall crumble, stone by stone. Finally, the prosecution produced one last piece of evidence: phone records. They showed calls made from his number to the very man who had tried to bribe the maid. They showed late-night conversations with the contractor who'd been threatened. They showed coordination, planning, intent. The brother's face drained of color. The mother clutched his hand, but even she looked shaken. The courtroom murmured again, louder this time. I sat through it all with my heart hammering, my hands clenched so tight my nails dug into my palms. I wasn't gloating yet. I learned too well that things can twist at the last second, but I could feel it. The tide was no longer just turning, it was crashing. The closing argument sealed it. The prosecution spoke plainly. This is not about grief. This is not about family drama. This is about fraud, about lies, about a deliberate attempt to steal from the very woman this man wanted to protect. They gestured toward me then, and I felt every eye in the room on me. The evidence speaks for itself. He left his legacy to her. They tried to erase that. The law does not permit it. The defense flailed in their closing, clinging to sympathy, to half-truths, to the image of a fragile mother and a grieving brother. But the words rang hollow, stripped of weight by weeks of evidence. The jury left to deliberate. Hours stretched into the longest day of my life. I sat on that hard wooden bench, staring at the floor, every tick of the clock loud as thunder in my ears. And then finally, the bailiff called us back in. The foreman stood, paper in hand, voice steady. We, the jury, find the defendants guilty on all counts. The words rang through the room like a bell. My breath caught, my body trembled, tears filled my eyes, not of weakness, but of release. They were guilty. The empire of lies had collapsed. The brother sat frozen, his mouth slightly open. The mother let out a sharp, wounded cry, clutching her chest as though the verdict itself had struck her. Reporters scrambled, cameras flashed, pens scratched furiously across notepads. I closed my eyes and felt a weight lift that I'd carried for far too long. Justice had spoken. But revenge doesn't end with a gavel. The fallout was still to come. Their downfall wasn't just in the courtroom, it was in what came after, when the world outside those walls reacted, when the life they had built on lies crumbled to dust in public. The verdict might have been the thunderclap, but the storm that followed was the true downfall. You could see it in their faces the moment the gavel hit. Shock, disbelief, and then a hollow rage that had nowhere to go. But what happens after the courtroom is sometimes more brutal than the trial itself, because it's not confined to legal arguments or polite walls. It spills into the streets, into the newspapers, into every whispered conversation. The brother was led out first, flanked by officers, his once perfect suit rumpled, his eyes darting like a trapped animal. Cameras flashed wildly, reporters shouting questions he couldn't answer. He tried to hold his head high, but the world had already shifted. He wasn't the grieving son anymore, he was a convicted fraud. The mother followed, her fragile act collapsing under the weight of reality. She wailed and clutched at her pearls, but even sympathy has limits, and the public had grown tired of her theatrics. For months, she'd painted herself as the victim, but now, exposed by evidence and lies, she was simply a woman complicit in a cruel scheme. The news spread like wildfire. Headlines screamed about the betrayal, the millions, the secret recordings. Talk shows dissected every detail. Neighbors whispered, strangers debated in coffee shops. And the one thing that united them all was this: they were guilty and justice had been served. The businesses they had run began to collapse. Partners pulled out, investors fled, employees resigned en masse. The house they had clung to, the very house they had thrown me out of, was no longer theirs. Notices were served, locks changed, possessions inventoried for auction. I walked through it once, quiet and slow, touching the walls that once felt like cages to me. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't triumphant. I was free. That was enough. The brother tried to appeal, of course. His lawyers filed motions, scrambled for technicalities, but the foundation was gone. You can't appeal the truth when it's recorded on video, when witnesses are consistent, when evidence is stacked higher than your lies. Each attempt failed. Each effort dragged him deeper into debt and ruin. Eventually, even his lawyers stopped pretending they believed in his story. The mother retreated from public life, her health truly failing this time, not from grief, but from the stress of exposure. People stopped visiting, friends stopped calling, sympathy dried up when the mask came off. She once commanded rooms with her false frailty, but now she sat alone in silence, haunted by the son who dragged her down with him. And me? I stood in the ashes of their downfall, holding pieces of a life I thought I'd lost. I had the house, I had the businesses, I had financial stability I never asked for but deeply needed. But most of all, I had my dignity back. They couldn't erase me. They couldn't steal what was rightfully mine. Still, victory comes with its own shadows. Nights would come when I lay awake wondering if I had become like them, consumed by revenge, driven by the need to win. I asked myself, was it worth it? Did I lose a part of myself in the process? But each time, I thought back to that night outside the courthouse when I'd asked my husband, in the silence, what to do. I'd hear his voice in memory again. You're stronger than you think. And I knew I hadn't become them. I had survived them.
People sometimes ask me, would you do it all again? Would you fight this hard for revenge? And I'll be honest with you, since you've been with me through this whole story, yes, I would. Because this wasn't just revenge, it was justice. It was reclaiming what was mine, protecting the memory of the man I loved, and refusing to let cruelty rewrite the truth. But what about you? Tell me honestly, if you were thrown out, humiliated, stripped of your home, and then found out the very people who betrayed you had tried to steal your future too, would you have fought like I did? Would you have waited, planned, endured the long nights and the threats just to see the guilty finally fall? Or would you have walked away and let them keep what wasn't theirs? Because for me, walking away was never an option. I didn't just get revenge, I got my life back. And when I look around now at the house they once stole, at the life I rebuilt from the ground up, I know this. They hated me when I was alone, but when the truth came out, it was them who were left with nothing. And that's the ending of my story. A story of loss, betrayal, patience, and ultimately justice.